if you're in business, the first thing you have to know is your own business very well. Who are your best people? Who are your best customers? Where do your revenues, where do your sales come from? And then you start off in everything you do and doubling down on what's working. You double down on your best customers, your best people, and pursue those.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another fabulous episode of the Healthcare Trailblazers podcast. I am thrilled to be sitting here today with the one and only Scott Becker. Scott is, I think, the king of healthcare content, definitely on LinkedIn. I cannot get through my LinkedIn feed without seeing Scott's one of his multiple podcasts. And newsletters and articles, at least literally 20 to 30 times in my feed every single day on various different topics. Scott is obviously super accomplished. I believe you're a lawyer, right?
Yes, lawyer by background, exactly. Yes. And then ended up starting a media company. I've had great fun with both those things. Have straddled two careers for 30 years and have great fun. But no, and we love getting a chance to visit with people. So we're very thankful to be on with you today, Mendel. Thank you very much.
Yeah, like I said, the pleasure is absolutely ours. So let's kind of get into it. Everybody knows the name Scott Becker. I don't think there's that many videos of your face going around LinkedIn, so I'm excited to I know there's a couple, I've seen one or two, but excited to kind of pull the veil back. So Scott, why don't you talk to us about how you got started? You're a lawyer. Were you practicing in healthcare specifically? Let's talk about how you got started and how you moved to healthcare.
Sure. No, 100%. Yes. So I was a young lawyer at a large firm, and at some point, this goes back 30 plus years ago, was trying to build a thought leadership, a brand, what you'd call today thought leadership. You're following in healthcare. I was working in a few different areas in healthcare, and started sort of publishing newsletters and sort of hosting small conferences, particularly back in the day. This goes back 30 plus years ago, around the surgery center area, and was trying to build a brand, build a business as a lawyer. And at some point, what I started to do in healthcare, which was create thought leadership pieces, create sort of content, conferences, and really newsletters. And back in the day, this is how long ago it was, we used to send out a mailing list letter to a group of contacts and so forth. And at some point, that started to pick up steam, and that became sort of the genesis of what is now Becker's Healthcare, which has become a relatively large media provider in the healthcare area, hospitals and health systems, health IT, still surgery centers, still orthopedic and spine, but it's grown to be one of the leading sort of digital outlets in healthcare, particularly in hospitals and health systems. And then we have big conferences too, and we're in our 30th plus year of it. 20 plus years ago, we really got a whole lot more serious about it and hired some great people, and those people really lead the team today and have done a tremendous job of building out what we call now Becker's Healthcare, and it's been a great journey and great fun. Go ahead, Mendel.
Yeah, no, it's amazing to look at what it is now. And I'm sorry, you said how many years ago did you start it?
Well, started it 30 plus years ago. I was in my 20s, but it just gives me some sense of aging myself and so forth. But at the time that we started it, it was really around a couple areas that became much smaller than what the company is today. We still have, we're in our 30th plus year of our surgery center conferences, and we're still very active in those areas. But what really exploded and grew was our hospital and health system area, and we had great leadership on the business side, great leadership on the editorial side. People like Malik Gamble, Laura Durda, that still really run the editorial side today, along with Mackenzie Bean and Brian Zimmerman and some others, Ellen Condon, and then on the business side, Jessica Cole and some other people. And we were really able to grow. I developed sort of a platform, and then I hired people much better than myself, and that's not false humility, that's true. And then they were able to grow it into a whole different thing. And I think there's a story there in any company founder, and we talk about this a lot, the different phases of a founder's leadership, and when they really grow to a different level is when they start hiring people that are better than themselves, that could do everything better than they used to do them. You start off in most businesses as sort of what they used to call the bottle washer, the chief cook, the everything. We do everything. And at some point you start to it's all about growing great people, great teams to build anything substantial. So we now live literally in the we're still a lawyer and we live in the media world in the healthcare area, but we've been great teams of people that have been able to drive that and trying to stay, very useful in terms of our content to health system leaders, physician leaders, CEOs, CFOs, vice presidents of nursing, chief nursing officers, CIOs, et cetera, and try and make sure we're very focused on that audience and getting them great content that's useful to them.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a number of fantastic points, and I think one worth highlighting is that idea of different roles for different roles, and different skill sets for different roles, and it's something that I talk about often. I was in California last week, and I was flying next to this guy who was going from working for Molina over to TikTok, which was quite an interesting conversation. But anyway, I was talking about a couple of things that I'm doing, and he was like, "Wow, that's so great, that's so cool, it's so impressive." And meanwhile, he's like, "Where'd you go to school?" And I'm like, "I didn't." And meanwhile, he's gone through college and he has all his degrees, and it was interesting because I said the same point to him. I said, there's different skill sets for different roles, and when building out a company, you need to be really cognizant of that. And me being able to be scrappy and being able to think outside the box because I don't necessarily have this training of exactly how things are supposed to go is super beneficial for me in this role right now. But I also have to be conscious that as we grow out, and like to your point, once you start scale, that's actually when when kind of the very structured, very, very, so to speak, what you might look at as boxed in is actually positive structure. And you got to bring those people in to actually start solidifying that foundation and build kind of an edifice or a structure that's actually going to be sound. And so, yeah, fantastic point there. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, no, and there's something else you said is that so many people that are successful entrepreneurs didn't grow up in the business that they're an entrepreneur in. And in some ways, it allows you to have a totally different lens of things. So when I started a media business, I didn't really plan to start a media business, but it was really focused on the content we were creating and being useful to our audience and developing a platform and being in the center of that network. And what was so fascinating about it is people that grew up in the media business, and this was a long time ago, would sort of scoff at the way we approached it. So back in the day when we hired writers and journalists and editors, they would all say, the way we work is we publish one great piece a week, and I'll use a name from the past, like we're George Will. And we were essentially so that's not really how we work today. We're going to publish a lot of short pieces that are easy for readers to view. And then the other thing that happened from taking a totally different perspective was we were playing against incumbent media outfits that had these huge print magazines and huge print distributions. And I was sort of at the dawn of the digital age, dawn of the internet, which is so hard for younger people to even fathom today. But we couldn't compete in the structure that had been created in media because we were self-funded. We couldn't do it and print a print magazine that went out weekly and went out to 50, 60, 70,000 people without going broke very quickly. So
Yeah.
we would have a whole bunch of people that said, well, you have to do it that way. And by necessity, we couldn't. But I also wasn't so bought into that way, whatever that way was, because I was really not from the space. I was from a legal background. Again, it's been already 2 minutes and I've not said, went to Harvard Law School, so was a relatively bright guy, not as bright as other people, but smart, and just couldn't see how I was going to make that business model work that had been the traditional business model in media. And so sort of pivoted to one that worked for us, which is trying to be, okay, we can't win on print because we'll economically just get destroyed, but could try and win on digital and be the leading place, sort of the business place for healthcare in the digital world. And that's the route we ended up taking.
Yeah, and so if we can try, I'd love to try to get into your mind a little bit. Like I said, that the podcast is Healthcare Trailblazers and really focused on the actual person blazing the trail. So that's a little interesting to me because you're a lawyer, which means that that usually speaks to, I don't know you well enough to say this, but being a lawyer usually speaks to a personality type that's going to school, they're focused, they've got that kind of like button down personality that they do well with legal briefs and all that kind of stuff. But today, you've moved away from that and you went in the other kind of like more scrappy direction, entrepreneurial, built this big thing. The way you talk now is very much is very entrepreneurial rather than like Mr. Lawyer. So How does that, like, where's your true personality and how do those kind of dynamics interplay?
Yeah, I think like most people, somewhat multifaceted. I mean, I was always, I saw, I mean, I would say I almost accidentally went to law school. I was always an entrepreneurial young person. Was always a person that was either had a business washing windows or shoveling snow or had a moving business. We always had different businesses when I was a teenager on through college and so forth. It was always sort of a business person. And in the environment and world that I grew up in, sort of in a middle class, sort of upwardly mobile world, the concept was in the community I grew up in, you could be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant. Those were the three choices that my parents said were my choices. It's sort of like very much like those were viewed as safe choices by my parents that didn't grow up in an affluent world. But I was always sort of a mix of ended up doing that with the concept that some of the role models that we grew up with were people that had been a professional but were also somehow or another in business as well. Like they were either like had an uncle that was a lawyer and did some real estate stuff, some other, but those were sort of the role models you know, for being able to be economically safe and sort of grow to that next spot, and from a family that had periodically gone bankrupt. So it was very important to me to be economically sound. So, and I'd always been naturally built to do entrepreneurial things. So there's a combination of factors. I went to law school in part because I got into Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School was sort of like, like parents were, yeah, my parents were first generation here. And to them and to me, this is sort of what it this was just you can't go wrong going to Harvard Law School. I did really well on my law school admission test back when those were a thing, and they're still a thing. But and I did well in college and got into Harvard Law School. It was like, okay, I guess I'll go to law school. I didn't know if I'd be a partner in a law firm, partner in an accounting firm. I was looking for a serious profession where I could then do other things with. And so it wasn't, and then getting into the media business happened a little bit by accident, but there's also a great sort of notion for entrepreneurs is, so much of success is keeping your eyes open to what's working, and being able then to double down on it. And we believe in this very truly with businesses, with niches, with people. And so what happened with me is I started publishing stuff to develop a thought leadership role as a lawyer, to build a practice as a lawyer. And some of it started to have started to resonate with people. I started to host these small conferences. The conferences started to make a small amount of money, enough to pay the bills for them. But it was clear after a little while that there was a real opportunity there. And so when I preach to people that are entrepreneurs, I'm a huge fan of people that are entrepreneurs that at some point worked a regular job, that sort of grew up as some kind of, in business somehow or another, had employers, saw things. I mean, I think it's very hard to come up with ideas. Like some people talk about the idea of an abstract thinking entrepreneur. I'm not that. I'm an incremental thinker. I could see trends when I'm engaged in the world. I'm engaged in things when I'm busy. Then I could see things and pursue them. I think it's very hard to like brainstorm being an entrepreneur. I think
Yeah.
periodically things come to you, see them. Some people are so brilliant they could do that. I cannot, and I don't mean that as
Yeah.
false humility. That is true. I cannot. I see things, I grab them. I'm a big fan of like when people. If you're in business, the first thing you have to know is your own business very well. Who are your best people? Who are your best customers? Where do your revenues? Where do your sales come from? And then you start off in everything you do and doubling down on what's working.
Yeah.
You double down on your best customers, your best people, and pursue those. And so
Yeah.
that's how we sort of view it, Mendon.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah, and I say that to people also. Like the entrepreneur has become so romanticized and so like turned into this thing to like, oh, I can't have a job, I can't get paid by somebody else because I have to be an entrepreneur. And so you've got these young guys that are just going out there trying to be entrepreneurs. And how do you know they're an entrepreneur? Because they're a CEO. How do you know they're CEO? Because there's a website that they put up that says they're the CEO, that they paid $9.99 on Wix to put up. So that's the big entrepreneurial journey. And you're absolutely correct. One of the best ways to actually do something is go get a job, get into an industry, And if you are actually an entrepreneur, you're going to have an entrepreneurial lens on, and that's the way you're going to look at everything. And to your point, when you see a problem, when you see a gap, your entrepreneurial brain is going to start thinking, hey, how do I solve this? How do I solve this? But just sitting around the world, it's almost like a comedian, right? A comedian that's trying to be a comedian, and they sit down with a pen and paper and they say, all right, let me come up with jokes. Let me come up with jokes. And they're racking their brain and they're trying to come up with a joke. Versus you have someone that's actually a funny human that walks through life and sees comedic things through the lens of their being a comedian, but looks at the same thing that you would look at, but they see a joke there, and that becomes hilarious because that's their lens, right? And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Like, there's no need to like kind of starve yourself and go sit on the floor and eat ramen and call yourself an entrepreneur. Go get a job, get into an industry, understand the vertical, understand the space. And if you're actually an entrepreneur, you will come up with ideas. That will happen.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
No, I think your perspective on the comedian is brilliant. I've never heard it said like that. I think that's exactly right. It's very hard to abstract to come up with ideas. I mean, I know people that could do it, but it's very few and far between. And then the ability to execute on those ideas is so important as well. I think your perspective on it's right on. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So looking now where Becker's Healthcare is and where you started, is this what you envisioned? Did you envision, like, what was your vision starting out, or were you just taking it step by step?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I think the answer to that is always yes and no. Certainly, when we started it, we didn't look at it as though we were going to build a media company in the least bit. We looked at it as though we were sort of enjoying doing what I was doing, which is creating content, connecting with people, and visiting with people, and building a legal practice. And then at some point, about 8 to 10 years in, I had hired a whole bunch of people full time. One of those people ended up being just extraordinary, a woman named Jessica Cole, and she's the CEO and president of Becker's Healthcare today. And her and I had sat down probably 20 plus years ago and said, okay, we now have sort of a problem because we've actually built something to some size. It was relatively small. And we now have to figure out what we're trying to do with this. Where are we trying to go? And so at that point, Jessica and I, looked at a few different media companies and tried to figure out how we wanted to position ourselves. And we sort of said, okay, there was one media company that had 20 different lines, of which 3 or 4 of them were generating all the revenues. There was another media company that was just in one area. And the problem with just being in one area is you're subject to that area entirely. And then also, to build a company, we needed great writers, great event planners, great salespeople, and we couldn't build it in too narrow an area and be able to have the type of team that we wanted to have. And so you end up with this thing where things sort of go hand in hand. You're trying to build a great team. To build a great team, you can't be so small because you got to be able to afford a great team. And so you end up somewhere in between. So did we plan it this way? Yes and no. We didn't plan it this way originally. At some point 20 plus years ago, we did sit down and say we want to be in 5 to 7 core areas, that they're all relatively significant. And then what we did was follow what was happening as one area got bigger and bigger. We didn't keep this hard, non-flexible lens on. We said we didn't expect the hospital and health system area to be, at the end of the day, the largest area of the company, but it was pretty apparent to us after a couple of years that we should keep on doubling down in that area because we were just getting so much responsiveness, and there was obviously a gap to be filled, and we were hiring great people that were providing great, what we call now, short form journalism, giving people the sense of what's going on. I tell this truly and jokingly that back in the day, I'm a lawyer and a CPA by background, thought I was really bright, would write these long strategic pieces, and nobody would read them. A few people would read them, but what people are really looking for is short form. Here's what's going on. Here's what's going on in the industry. Here's the trends. Here's what I sort of want to understand what's going on. And a large portion of people were very interested in that. And a much smaller portion were interested in deeper dive pieces. And the other thing we came to the conclusion on very early on is there's some things we could do well. We could do the business of healthcare pretty well. What we couldn't do well was the clinical side of healthcare. Look, we were never going to be the New England Journal of Medicine or be able to analyze how exactly is something clinical development going on. That just wasn't going to be our strength. And so we were very good about being disciplined and coming back to things that we could do well that also resonate with the audience. And it's a constant, obviously. We've been at it for 30 plus years.
Yeah.
It's a constant challenge to make sure that we've hired magnificent people that now lead these teams, and it's a constant challenge by them to make sure that we stay relevant, that we stay useful, that we stay something that people want to read, that,
Yeah.
that people want to listen to, or people want to come to our meetings. And so
Yeah.
it's a constant effort to stay fresh and stay healthy.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you are different in that regard. Like most podcasts, like even this podcast, we do these 45-minute clips, and it was really interesting that you do those 10-minute short audio, hit and run type pieces. And obviously, I mean, what kind of engagement are like what does that look like from an engagement perspective?
Yeah, no, we found over time that sort of like we're always trying to find in life the Venn diagram overlap of what works for us and what works for our audience. So from my perspective, I enjoy tremendously getting to visit with people, and I'm comfortable in a 10-minute format or a 2-hour format and so forth. What we found was that often our listeners our average, downloads are higher for a smaller, shorter episodes. Like so it's easier and it's complicated in the podcast world. 'Cause at one point in the podcast world, people were looking for just longer form things. Like Joe Rogan does an all-day show
Yeah.
that's crazily successful. And
Yeah.
I actually, I know he's politically polarizing. I enjoy listening to him. I don't listen to him all the time, but I do enjoy listening to him. He's just an
Sure.
original voice and fascinating. But at one point we thought we'd do long form episodes, but our stats kept on showing, and this is part of following what you're seeing, that downloads were better for us for relatively short episodes. We used to say this, and this was a perspective I had. We're in the conference business. We have lots of big live conferences where we've had huge celebrities speak. President Bush, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Nikki Haley, all kinds of people have spoken. Mark Cuban spoke recently. A lot of
Nice.
fascinating people. Venus Williams, all kinds of interesting people. And what I found so fascinating was, if you look at the TED Talk universe today, the 15-minute talk, in some ways we were doing shorter sessions at our conferences a long time ago than was popular, than people thought was popular. But 30, 40-minute sessions. And so every speaker would say to me, I need more time than 30 minutes. And we would say to every speaker, the audience disagrees. And we'd say it jokingly, but truly, because the audience much preferred shorter sessions for a million reasons. I mean, there might be some speakers that could really captivate an audience for a long time. But I mean, Seinfeld said this beautifully about why he stopped. He stopped when he stopped because the audience still loved him when he stopped. And for most of our speakers, there's very few. Comedians are very good at doing an hour, 20-minute show. They do a 2-hour show, people want to go. And there's this fine line on it. But we found shorter sessions are much, much more popular than longer sessions. And we found for us the same thing on our podcast. And it's not that once in a while you can't have somebody that can captivate somebody for hours, but it's few and far between. And when people first started listening to podcasts, they were looking for long things they could download and walk with. And then the podcast universe changed as well towards short forms acceptable too.
Yep. Yeah. It's really interesting just observing that. I think you have a really unique balanced skill set between like the entrepreneurial side of you that jumps into things, realizes things, because that's also that lens, right? Just being able to realize an opportunity is kind of an entrepreneurial thing. But I think like that, so to speak, lawyer side of you is the disciplined one that allows you to actually realize the data and focus in on the data. And I think that because you have a lot of entrepreneurs that they're just all over the place and they're always jumping to the next shiny thing, and they're entrepreneurial, but they're 7 years later, they're still working really, really hard to get anywhere because they just keep running. They don't know how to hone in on a thing. And it's really interesting to watch how, consistently through the things that you're saying, you're talking about that dynamic, like realize a thing, go out. Like you started really early. You started the late 90s, if 30 years ago, whatever it was. that wasn't realizing something that was already working. That was like super new for its time to do this kind of thing. But then within what you did, you started honing in on what was working and making those direction decisions based on that. I think that's a fascinating lesson because for people that don't necessarily have that natural instinct to do both, they could look at somebody like you and learn that and say, hey, look at this, realize some of the new things realize an opportunity, but then be disciplined. Force yourself to be disciplined.
Yes, we talk about multiple different concepts. We talk about being able to periodically pivot, but to your point, it's not pivoting every moment. You got to go deep enough to figure out what's there before you pivot and pivot and pivot. So it's sort of like trying to stay stable and pivot. We always talk about people being successful in the law firm that were smart and could get things done, people that were hardworking and could think. So at some point, you could get people that were hyper task oriented, but they weren't thinking hard enough to grow enough. So you're thinking you need to sort of be both task oriented and smart, hardworking and good personal skills. And we sort of view this mix of qualities as critical. To people that we view as successful are usually fairly bright, they're fairly driven, and they've got good personal skills. Some mix of the three, and not always, but we view it as we look at people, as we grow teams, we look at, do people have that mix of qualities? Are they hardworking and are they smart? Are they motivated and are they good people? It's sort of this mix of qualities, and it's so important to so many things. But I think your point on, the other thing that I learned very early, and I got lessons from a couple of different people, is that any kind of real success, like people iconicize or make iconic the thought of the maverick entrepreneur, or the thought of the Steve Jobs, the Elon Musk, whoever it might be. And there's two things that come to mind. First, even though they might be iconic, nobody does anything without great teams. And one of the lessons I learned early, both from a mentor I had and from work and from reading, is it's all about teams. If you want to get any place significant, you need teams. You need great people. There's also a great book I read 100 years ago about, tens hire sevens or something like that. You have to be very willing to hire people that are as good or better than you and not be threatened by it. So you can't get into the trap of hiring people that you think you could manage closely. It's much easier to hire great people, let them thrive, and then management is easy. We often say the simple trick to management is to hire great people, not to have to manage. And I say that jokingly because there's some mix of the both, but the easiest way to be a great manager, the easiest way to be a great coach, is to have great players, great teammates. And we bought into that very hardcore a very long time ago, that everything's about having great teammates.
Yeah. And I think there's another dynamic to that, which is the fact that usually great people are self-driven to a large extent, because if they're great, then they're passionate about the thing they're doing, then that quality usually comes along. When I hire employees, the first question I ask them is, I say, what do you enjoy doing? Because typically what I find is that what people enjoy doing is the thing that they're good at, and the thing that they're good at is the thing that they enjoy doing. And so it's a very easy way to kind of reverse engineer that process of putting someone in the right place. But when you end up with the opposite, if you have people that are just unhappy in their position, then to your point, then you end up really having to all of a sudden manage all these people and a bunch of employees that aren't showing up and they're not executing. And now you have a whole headache when, to your point, hire great people that are good at what they do, that are passionate about what they do. And you'll find yourself not having to check the time cards every 2 weeks because they're actually going to be getting their job done,
No, and that's very much how we look at it. We view it as, when I talk to people about career advice, it's what do you enjoy doing, what are you good at, and what do people need? So trying to hit this Venn diagram with those three things, what do you enjoy, what are you good at, and where's the overlap with what the firm needs or what the world needs, whatever it is. And we view that very much as what you're saying is very much right on. And we want our people that work with us to thrive and to have this overlap where they're thriving and building great brands for themselves, and there's some overlap with what the company needs as well. But we want people thriving, and we want them thriving side by side in sync with the company, but we want them thriving, and that's really the perspective on it.
Incredible. Final question for you here. You mentioned that you're self-funded, right?
Well, I was self-funded for a very long time, and then five,
Okay.
6 years ago, we brought in an outside investor as well. But yes, but we funded it myself for literally 25 plus years. And we were able, like, it's a different world. We weren't in the venture capital world where you're sort of growing, or I didn't have the wherewithal, not nearly as to be Jeff Bezos, where I just grew like crazy without profitability. We view it as very much, businesses run on cash flow like armies run on food. So we were making a little bit of money along the way. It wasn't like we were funding it. I was also had, you know, independent salary and job, so we had money to help fund it. But as we started to hire people, it was scary. I mean, it was scary because it wasn't, I didn't have so much money put away. I didn't grow up with money. Didn't inherit money. We funded out of what we were doing, and so cash flow was critical. It
Yeah.
wasn't one of these things where you looked at it and said we could just grow the heck out of it and deficit fund it.
Yeah.
We ran out of cash flow and grew out of cash flow, and then when we did finally bring in an outside investor 6, 7 years ago, one of the beauties of it, it allowed us to take some bigger chances on things. We were able to hire some bigger keynote speakers, go to some bigger venues, do some things that just as a naturally nervous, anxious entrepreneur, I wouldn't, and that's where sort of the lawyer thing comes in as well. By nature, I'm cautious, even though we're entrepreneurial as well, but we're cautious. We're not one to gamble big. And so we're able, as we brought in outside funding, outside capital, to be able to breathe a little bit easier and take some bigger chances,
Yeah.
and be able to put more money into certain things that I would have been very scared to as a sole funding source.
Yeah. All right, we'll close out with Scott. This is obviously a legacy company. It's Becker's Healthcare. You're Scott Becker. You've built something tremendous thus far. Looking back in 30, 40, 50 years at the company, where do you want it to be? What's kind of what's the goal?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I don't have, that clear an answer to it. I'm very much an incremental thinker. I'm very much a blocker and tackler, who tries to see things. And I think we've got great leadership. And the key is to keep on building out great leadership, to keep on having enough smart people at the helm that they could sort of double down on the opportunities that we have and see opportunities. So we don't look at it and say, okay, oh my goodness, we're trying to be, one of the huge mega media companies of our time. We look at it and say, we want to be great at what we want to do. We want to be a magnet for listeners, readers, attendees. We want to take care of our customers well. And we're trying to be impactful and stay engaged in the world. Like we don't have this vision to say, nor do we ever to say, we want to be, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. We want to be great. We want to be niche centric, take care of customers, take care of people, and keep on doubling down on what works. I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't have this megalo mindset of we need to acquire 50 companies and become, a multi-billion-dollar company and do this and do that. We're rather an incremental grower, for positive, for good or for bad.
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding. It seems to be working. So excited to see your continued, expansive growth. And even if it's incrementally, it's obviously, like I said, it's working. But this has been a really stimulating discussion. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Mendel, you're a tremendous interviewer, and thank you very much for visiting with me today. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.